Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to another morning discussion about the trials and tribulations that our small businesses are facing. I'm really fortunate to have a great panel here today. I think it's going to be an awesome discussion. I think you're going to come away with a lot of tips and also get some insight on sort of, some understanding of what other businesses are dealing with as the pandemic drags on. Before we get to the panelists, I want to introduce Roxanne Cook, who is a regional director for Chase in New England. And I just found out yesterday that JP Morgan Chase, it's obviously a New York company, but the founder, the namesake of the company, actually graduated from English high school in Boston. So unbeknownst to many people, that JP Morgan Chase has roots here in Boston. So before we get to the panel, Roxanne, if you could talk a little bit about, give some opening remarks, that would be great.
John, thank you so much. On behalf of my JP Morgan Chase colleagues, we are really excited to be partnering with you to sponsor this very important discussion. So structural barriers in the US have created profound racial inequalities, and that has just been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And the existing racial gap has put a strain on the economic mobility of many, many families. At JP Morgan Chase, we're committed to closing the opportunity gap and working with our strategic partners to lift Boston's minority businesses up. Dorchester Bay Economic Development Corporation is one of these partners, and our recent $525,000 investment is supporting Dorchester Bay in its efforts to provide affordable commercial rent, technical assistance, and microloans to business owners. John, as we enter what we all hope is a recovery, we want to deepen the partnership with our city and our neighbors to come back stronger and ensure that people of all backgrounds, have the resources they need to successfully come out of this pandemic. So thank you for joining this important discussion today. I hope today's discussion will provide a new perspective for you, and you'll take away some helpful tactics and tips for how we can work together to create a more inclusive future for Boston's small business. So John, thank you, and thank our esteemed panelists. I look forward to this discussion.
Great. Thanks, Roxanne. I'm going to get right to the panel here because I really want to hear what they have to say. Joining us this morning, we have Nia Evans from the Boston Ujima Project, Sheldon Lloyd, who is CEO of City Fresh Foods, Glenn Lloyd, who is the head of the Foundation for Business Equity, and yes, Sheldon Lloyd's brother. This might be the first time they've ever been on this panel together, so this is a momentous occasion for us. And Jen Fagel, Executive Director of Commonwealth Kitchen. Thanks a lot. Before we get into sort of the deep questions, I want to hear, you're all dealing with small businesses every day right now, and I was wondering if we could just go around and talk about sort of what the general mood is and what's the biggest challenges that you're hearing right now from the people you're talking to. And maybe we can start with Jen on that.
Sure. Thanks, John. Appreciate being here and with my amazing colleagues who we are all better in the city of Boston for having all these great people all working together to really try to respond to this unprecedented crisis. So Commonwealth Kitchen, I think folks know, we run the Food Business Incubator and Development Program in the city of Boston. We work with over 250 restaurants, food trucks, caterers, cafes, bakers, and no surprise, it's really, really hard. A lot of our businesses are really decimated at this point, and it's only about to get worse. And so I appreciate the conversation about winter is coming. What does that mean? And so certainly in the restaurant community, patios are not going to last a lot longer. Food trucks are not moving. And so it's a lot of pain and a lot of businesses not knowing what to do and waiting for government relief that has not yet come. So that's it's a very sobering, difficult time.
Nia, what are you hearing?
Thank you, John, and thank you, John and the Boston Globe for inviting Ujima to participate in this conversation today. Would also like to acknowledge my colleagues on the panel. I think this is going to come up later, so I really do just want to accentuate the ways in which we are all in relationship with each other and work together. So really quickly, Ujima is Swahili for collective work and responsibility. Boston Ujima Project can most briefly be described as a cooperative business, finance, and arts ecosystem. And just to talk about our relationships really quickly, Commonwealth Kitchen is a technical assistance partner of Ujima's. City Fresh is a member of Ujima's founding Business Alliance, and Foundation for Business Equity is a longtime collaborator, and we're working at deeper relationship and partnership. And I'm pretty sure we'll return to that later in the conversation. We're a smaller network. We work with a range of businesses from sole proprietorships to micro businesses to cooperatives to then much larger businesses like Sheldon. And I mention that to say that we definitely see unique needs that tie to the unique characteristics of the business. So we've had some businesses in our network that have closed. We've had some of our cooperatives, because they are cooperative, because they are worker owned, they participate in decision making together. And so they've made a decision to kind of rally, for example, and protect each other as people, and do things, for example, like take pay cuts to keep the business alive and to have more stamina and longevity. We have another business like Fresh Food Generation that I know works with Commonwealth Kitchen, and they've worked in partnership with Commonwealth Kitchen in this. They have pivoted. They started out in the pandemic, for example, delivering food to health centers, and now they've expanded that to delivering home care packages. And so I just mentioned those examples just to say the responses of our businesses definitely run the gamut, depending on the types of businesses they are and the sectors in which they operate.
Great. Glenn, what are you seeing at the foundation?
Yeah, and just, again, thank you. And it's good to be seeing my colleagues here in the setting. Yeah, no, it's similar to what Nia had mentioned. We've worked with now about 70 companies. We work with them pretty intensely. They run the gamut, in sector. And I think a lot of it depends on what sector you're in. I mean, Jen, you start off with Jen, and if you're running a restaurant right now, your impact is a lot different, right? When you're told to close down essentially, and then you can only reopen at like 40% capacity, and you already had really slim margins based on your industry, that's hard to think what your future looks like. And so you have those folks, and if folks in the trades, right? If you had a trade business in Boston, you couldn't come to work the next day. So you literally, daycares, you were shut down. So you have a whole host of those companies that are in a crisis kind of mode, still are to some degree. And then you've got companies, a good chunk of companies, a majority of companies we work with, were kind of like they could still do their business, but they were losing sales because of the broader influence, right? So they're down 10%, they're down 20%, down 30% in revenue, and they're kind of like kicking along. And we saw most of the companies kind of in that range, and then and still waiting for this thing to see a solution, which didn't happen right in the fall, and we don't know when it's going to really come. And then you actually have some companies, a sliver, I'll say, who are actually doing well because they're in the right space, groceries and delivery, to door and stuff like that. So I do think we've seen the gamut, but net, it's been a drag on our local economy lately.
Now, Sheldon, your business has done pretty well in the pandemic, all things considered. Can you talk about why that is, and maybe tell me like what you're seeing from your other small businesses in Boston?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you all for having us here today as well. We've seen, because of our space, and those who don't know what City Fresh does, but we've been supplying meals to seniors in general who are homebound. We actually go door to door. Schools, after schools, a lot of the nonprofit feeding programs, YMCA, around Boston. So and outside of Greater Boston. So for us, it's been the space of affordable, healthy meals. So when this hit, the schools were closed and folks still needed to get meals. So it really exposed our need, or the need for this type of service. So we've seen, just getting meals out, whether it be prepared meals or grocery box meals. We've seen, come together with some of the other agencies to see just, packing of meals and then getting them distributed around the city. That was kind of the first phase that still continues now. That comes in line with, job loss, and then, no place for kids to, go. So parents don't have, so they can't go to work either in many cases. So you really just saw that kind of grow. So that's really what we've been seeing here at City Fresh. The need for services like what we do, growing.
Great. Well, obviously the weather is getting a little colder. It's still, I guess you'd say this October has been warmer than most Octobers, but winter is around the corner. Jen did mention it's going to be tough for restaurants to prepare. What can restaurants do? Is there anything they can do to get ready? Should they plow forward with outdoor dining? Into the low temperatures, or should they figure out a way to go indoors, or should they pivot to something else? Jen, what's your take on that?
So of course the answer to that question is it depends. And so, what's interesting is when you look at the larger restaurants, typically white-owned restaurants that are in larger spaces, the 40, 60, 70 seat sit-down restaurants that also rely a lot on the bar for revenue. Those are the ones that are actually having even a harder time in this moment because they have higher fixed costs, they have more staff to even just to open their operation, and they rely more heavily on sit-down dining. And so as we watch going into the winter, I think you're going to see a lot of those sit-down restaurants really looking and deciding it may be time at least for a temporary close. We see this every year with food trucks where they decide come January, February, is this a moment to just take a break and then come back in the spring? And I think you're going to see more and more of restaurants that are more traditional sit-down restaurants with all these fixed costs needing to do that. What's been interesting is to see when you look at the neighborhood-based restaurants that are significant numbers that are owned by people of color, they tend to be takeout. They tend to be much smaller. So it's still a not insignificant amount of fixed cost, but it's different in terms of what they're faced with. And so they have a little bit more ability to pivot. The challenge for those businesses is they don't have any money, right? So they started at a place pre-pandemic where they were undercapitalized already. The structural model for restaurants was already a challenge. And so needing resources like the PPP program was enormously helpful at the beginning for those who could get it, which was not a lot of them. But if they could, it gave them the ability to have a little bit of cushion to be able to figure out what a pivot could be. So how do I take my food that now needs to all be online? How do I train my staff and convince consumers that our food is safe? How do I move from a menu type that can be better for people when doing takeout? Digital literacy, digital divide, huge issue for these businesses. But the hopeful thing here is that if we can start to find ways to connect these businesses to customers and to solve some of the delivery issues of, we all have heard the stories about how expensive these third-party apps are and how much they're taking from the business owners. There is some possibility to see these businesses continue to pivot and change and be creative, both in the food that they're giving and in the groceries and other ways that they are continuing to innovate. Having said all that, I continue to feel really concerned about the industry and just continue to look at city, state, federal government to say, this is where a bailout is needed. Like Main Street bailout is the thing that's going to get it through. But we do see this kind of mix of where businesses are in the restaurant industry.
So what do the other panelists think about what restaurants should do getting ready for winter?
I'll jump in quickly, and I you know, as being I call myself an innovative entrepreneur. This is a head scratcher, right? It's like, what do you really do for these businesses? But I think there is a little bit of a nugget of opportunity, because in some ways, if we can get the digital platforms, you know, competitive, it levels the playing field, because now you don't have to get in your car and go somewhere, and people wouldn't come in these communities maybe because of, you know, biases and so on and so forth. I was just talking to a owner of a West African, and I was looking at the menu and I'm like, oh my God, I love this stuff. So how do we bring that maybe more mainstream, and maybe, you know, the folks watching and listening, you know, your audience, John, if they knew these businesses existed, maybe they'd pick up the call, you know, and get some food coming their way. So, but it's just, I was just on a call with one of the larger Black-owned restaurants in our community, and they're up to 42% of what their revenues were. I mean, that's just like, how do you survive with those types of numbers? And so I do think this deserves infrastructure support. Like we need capital, grant-like capital, to come into these companies to make it through whatever that bridge is, and because otherwise we're going to see more and more drop off, unfortunately.
So you're saying it's really incumbent on both state, federal governments to get more money into the small
Well, if you want to go down that pathway, we can, John. But let me tell you, we've seen crazy types of bailouts happening to industries that, like, really, we need to be bailing out Main Street, and this is where the jobs are. This is where the wealth in these communities are, and we're abandoning these folks. I mean, come on, let's do it. So that, I would say absolutely yes.
And so just if I can put a quick point on this, we, back in April and May, we were able to get some money out of the City of Boston Resiliency Fund that we actually used to pay 14 Black and Latinx owned restaurants in every neighborhood of the city to feed their neighbors in need. It was not enough to replace the funding that they were going to lose from everything else that was going on at the time, but it was enough to actually, for them to be able to rehire some staff, to get their supply chain moving again, and to start to be innovative and to try some new things, try some specials, try some marketing, do some other things to continue to be the entrepreneurs they are, which is that, you know, they're survivors. They know how to do that. So you give them a nickel and they'll figure out how to turn it into $1. And so what we saw in that instance was like that little bit of help, but on a regular basis, we did it for 3 months, was the thing that got them to a much stronger place. Each one of those 14 businesses we were helping, that money from the city is now gone. And every single one of them will tell you right now, they do not know if they're going to make it through to next year.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. And I'd like to just triple down on the call for mainstream bailout. So I think what's important. So Jen just talked about what we were able to do locally coming together. So, for example, UGMA is part of a coalition with Foundation for Business Equity, where we were able to support, and this was under Glenn's leadership, 25 companies using relief capital. And as Jen is saying, and as I'm sure Glenn will affirm, great work and not a dent in the type of need that we're seeing. And I think what underscores the call for mainstream relief is we need to be able to allow businesses to make responsible choices. And so I'd just like to bring up a reminder, and I know that we know this, but just for the sake of the dialogue, a reminder that we're here in the context of a pandemic, which is a global public health crisis. And so the decisions that our businesses are making cannot be isolated from that context. So Sheldon, for example, talked about parents not being able to send their children to school. Some people cannot work. Some people are working in unsafe conditions. And when we think about the types of choices that people are having to make, unfortunately, early in this pandemic, people had to make unhealthy choices that prolonged this pandemic. And so I think we should also be engaging in this decision making in the context of a public health crisis that has not abated. And we should be looking at what is the best decision making, what are the best policy choices that actually allow us to really get this thing under control, so that restaurants and other businesses can make responsible choices about how they reopen. And that's key. I think in the absence of a Main Street bailout, in the absence of smart policy choices, we're forcing people to make bad, unhealthy decisions that prolongs this thing. And we're going to be talking about this next year and the following year.
Great. I wanted to, Jen, you mentioned some restaurants needing to pivot. I think we've all touched on that. I was wondering if we could talk more broadly about how small businesses can pivot. A lot of it has to do with going digital, going online. Glenn, you also mentioned that allows smaller restaurants to broaden their market. First, maybe Sheldon, you can tell me what your business has done to pivot, to adjust. What have been the biggest adjustments since COVID hit that you had to take? And then I'd like to hear from the other panelists about what kind of pivots you're seeing that have been successful.
Yeah, sure. It's been a long road. At first it was a lot of unknowns, and then most of it was getting staff comfortable with, being safe and coming to work, and then keeping staff safe. Our business is a business where you're packing, so there are people in close proximity, and then you're also delivering to people, and handing, seniors meals who are homebound. So for us, the biggest thing was safety, and getting that message to our staff. After we, had to dig up PPE equipment on our own because there wasn't any, to the point of where at the beginning we had folks at home making masks for us to bring them in, for our own staff. So luckily, a lot of those hurdles are clearly have been overcome. We've spaced out our staffing for different shifts and changed, configurations on packing. And I think, we've been successful in doing that and keeping safe. So then, a lot of our clients, the smaller ones, Glenn mentioned daycares, and so they're gone, not even sure where they are. And it pivoted more towards our larger clients that stepped up in hunger prevention, that we were already, partnered with and had relationships with, that decided to do more and get more meals out there. So that, that's what, helped us. Staying open helped us because we had some communities where their caterers had to close because of COVID. We were able to sustain through that. So we helped out some other communities by being able to do that type of work. I have to credit my team who stuck through this whole thing, through all the, the unknowns and fear. We kept moving through. So that's helped us to be successful. Consolidation, doing less but better at the things that we were doing, helped as well. I think, and as mentioned before, delivery, how important is delivery around the city and being able to do that. That was a gap that a lot of, and some of the restaurants had and other organizations had about getting food out. We were, set up for that, knowing the city and being able to get around. So we were able to get food out there too, because then there was times there was food supply, but there wasn't delivery that could manage that. So, fortunately and unfortunately, this is what we were good at and we were here. And in the city, very important, location, very important. And you guys touched on earlier, and I don't want to go back on that, but like when you're talking about the main streets and relief, leases and the landlords haven't relieved the commercial tenants, there's nothing there. So I think that's a part that really needs to be addressed, as moving forward.
So what other pivots are the rest of the panel seeing? Maybe Glenn or Nia, you could, what you're spotting. I'm particularly interested in any pivots that non-food businesses, because we've obviously got to the restaurants.
Yeah, no, we have some stories, John, that are based on necessity. One is one of your counterparts. I'll call them out. Alberto, who leads El Mundo, who a lot of their revenue was coming from convening, right? Great events throughout the city. That's not happening, and so he's had to Pivot, very creative entrepreneur, and doing bilingual kind of in real time media stuff, but putting it onto social media and doing some other types of contracts that are kind of unique around kind of getting his following to monetizing his following, I guess is really what I'd say, and really doing a multimedia platform is one example. We had a company actually a little farther out west who, they were retail and doing more production around, prints and stuff like that. And so they had to go completely online. And they've done it successfully. And I do want to say quickly that it's unfortunate in a lot of ways what happened this summer with the public lynching of George Floyd. Clearly, folks in the community know this is not a new thing, but the outpouring of national awareness around it has actually, in some cases, helped some of our businesses, right? Because now you have folks who are seeking and looking to do more business with some of our businesses of color, and that's been, I guess, a positive consequence of the craziness. And so we've seen some of that happening too.
Nia, what about you?
Yeah, and I don't know that I would call this a pivot, but we had one of our businesses that participated in LISC Boston's 6 Feet Apart Accelerator program. So this was a program that I can't remember the name of the group that they did this in partnership with. That program in and of itself was a pivot. When we had first learned about the program, that was a program that was aimed at digital marketing. And this is just thinking about digital marketing pre-pandemic. And so some of the businesses that we had lined up for that program with that in mind participated in the program even after then pivoted to be more about what Sheldon talked about. Actually, I believe both Sheldon and Jen talked about this in terms of how you communicate with customers right now during the pandemic and allow them to legitimately feel safe enough to support your business. So that's my understanding of what that program then focused on, and it focused on different types of businesses, not just the restaurant industry. And so we had a couple of companies participate in that program. They found it valuable. I do also find myself, Glenn, thinking about the uprisings in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and it really is interesting, as I said, the spectrum of responses that the businesses in our network undertook. I think definitely businesses in our network, and I would say probably Jen and Glenn, and I think this is what you're saying as well, Glenn, and Sheldon would agree. Not only the pandemic, but also this epidemic of police killing, for sure, I think has created an opportunity, for lack of a better word, for just really ambitious change. And really thinking about how we can be just doing things differently across the board. And so we've even gotten questions from our businesses on racial equity and racial justice, and also just acknowledging that Roxanne talked about that in her opening remarks. And so I would say just the very nature of how we do business, the very nature of how we relate to each other as people, for sure, I think is definitely up for examination right now. And I would say we see that in our businesses. So I don't think they are just thinking, and I don't know that they ever were, but they definitely right now are not just thinking, how do we generate a profit at the exclusion of the health of the people that work for them and the health of the communities that they work in, and so I think that is I find that a welcome development during these times.
Hey, John, can I just jump right back into this one? Because I think I want to acknowledge something that I think we all on the phone would, I think, agree, which is it's making sure these companies have the right tools and also, strengthen their balance sheets. That helps on pivot. And I do think that I know Jen goes deeper with these companies, and so does Nia, which is, the importance of really good advice and how do we make sure we get really good advice to these companies, especially now, and that costs money. And then clearly that advice, usually you see good results when it ties with capital, right? And what we call survival/growth capital. So I do think that when we talk about pivot, you got to have the ingredients and you got to have the support for these entrepreneurs to be able to make these pivots. And clearly another factor is customers, right? And contracts and so on and so forth, which I call another big part of this, leg of the stool. And so I do think that with the work with Commonwealth Kitchen, the work with the Foundation of Business Equity, UGMA, we work together to make sure that our entrepreneurs, have these tools available too. So I just want to kind of highlight that as part of that conversation.
So let me just on that one as well, two quick things too. One is I think we are having to pivot. We used to be cheerleaders for our businesses. That was our job. You got it. You're going to make it. I'm with you. You have confidence. We're going to make this happen together. And now our job is stop spending your money. Don't use your credit card, right? Like take a breath. I know this is hard, right? HR, unemployment insurance, debt consolidation. So there's a significant pivot that our organizations like all of ours have to take in how we are being responsible partners to our business owners. And I think the other pivot that we are seeing is, and everybody on this call, how we are all partnering differently. We've always been in the networks together and support each other because we love the work each other does. I think that there's a lot more intention right now to look at each other and say, wait a minute, like we gotta get together. Like, we gotta work on this now, and we have to figure out how we divide and conquer and look at our strengths as individual organizations to say, okay, Ujima's really good at this, go take care of that. Commonwealth, you got this, go work on that. And I think that is an enormously powerful and hopeful outcome of this. And I'll say even for us, looking at the partnerships we've had with community health centers around some of the feeding we've been doing, with different organizations around access to capital. So I do think we're seeing some other shifts that feel positive and a long-term change. And even our work with City Fresh Foods, we've talked forever about wanting to do a partnership. And we now actually are working together on a project where we're feeding families at the Boston Housing Authority. And in that case, to Sheldon's point, we don't do distribution. So guess what? They handle 100% of the distribution with the YMCA. So everybody kind of stay in their lane. But by doing that, we can actually be bigger and stronger and have more impact.
Yeah, and I think just one thing I'd like to add to that, just in terms of resources for businesses. So one of the things we did very impressively during the early days of the pandemic, as Jen and Glenn are saying, is pretty quickly coalesce, pretty quickly come together in a few different collaborations, a few different coalitions. And there are a few of those coalitions that are now emerging as a permanent organization from the pandemic. And so on that note, and so that's the importance, as Jen is saying, that's the importance of networks, and that's the importance of not just networks, but then hopefully at some point really deepening relationships within those networks. And so what I would say to the businesses that we work with is to also seek out those networks. So I know, for example, Commonwealth Kitchen has a listserv that they've started for businesses that are in the that are in the food sector. And I'm in it, even though I don't do food myself, just to stay informed. And that listserv is active. And so you see things from people saying, where can I get, I just saw something this morning that says something like, we need like 40 sweet potatoes, but we don't meet the minimum of this particular distributor. So I need help here. Where can I go? I actually have a whole bunch of extra sugar. Anybody needs them. UGMA has a business alliance and a business support team. You've talked with the Chamber of Commerce a few times. And so just to say on our side, on the kind of service provision side and the lending side, we have definitely seen the value of networks and relationships and doubled down on them. And I would encourage businesses who are not in some type of network themselves to really seek out those associations and seek out those alliances, because there of course is much more value in not working as a solo actor or working in an isolated fashion.
Well, that's great advice, Nia. I've come across a number of networks myself that I hadn't even thought to tap into covering the pandemic. So I know they're out there, and I think just about any business, there's probably 5 or 6 networks that would be applicable, depending on the location and the sector that they're in. Oh, Sheldon mentioned a big issue that a lot of businesses are facing, and this just came on. So I want to remind people that we do accept questions on the Q&A function on Zoom at the bottom of your screen. We just got one about tenants and relationships with landlords. This question was why it hasn't more been done by governments to step in and help out with that problem of not getting rent relief. I was wondering if the panelists could address this, but also address like what are you recommending to people that they do if they're struggling with their landlord? I mean, it's really obviously a problem. We just had the eviction moratorium in Massachusetts expire, but of course all that back rent still comes due. It's a big nut for any small business, even in good times. So I was hoping it's a lot to digest, but I was hoping you could. I mean, the fundamental thing is what's being done, what can be done, both by government and by individual small businesses to deal with this rent issue. Who wants to tackle it?
Well, maybe I'll get ahead of Jen because by the way, Jen has a secret power, which is real estate. So she's been involved with real estate over most of her career. And I know Sheldon is dealing with it day to day right now with the landlord at City Fresh. But I would say, from my perspective, I look at it where you have I hate to say it like this, simplified, but 2 tiers of landlords: those that are struggling and those that have some resources. And so I advise the businesses to know who their landlord is clearly, which tier they are, and really negotiate and try to put pressure if they have the balance sheets to withstand. You literally have to become a partner with your landlord, right? And what does that mean? I don't know. That means, you know what, I can't pay rent the next few months, or I have to pay it differently, and maybe we can share some revenue later. So I think a lot of the early conversations people had, PPP coming down the pike, I could use that to help. You got to take what you have to negotiate and try to really become partners. I think on the landlord side, what do you want? Do you want a vacant place, or do you want to keep the economy going? And do you have the wherewithal to make that happen based on your powers? And I do think on the folks who are less endowed, landlords, have less resources, they're help. That's where maybe public sector help needs to step up and be more thoughtful and innovative. And so, but I'll hand it over to my panelists who probably can get a little deeper on all that.
No, that was beautiful, Glenn. I think this is where you got to do a lot of block and tackling one at a time. So we know some restaurants that have more than one location. In one location, their negotiation with their landlord's good and they understand the need and they're trying to work in partnership. And in other cases, the landlord's, nope, you're out, go. And so you do our advice to anybody in a small business is, first of all, talk to your landlord, get in front of it. Don't wait for defaults and evictions and lawyers and you've gone there and you've escalated it to a place where it's very hard to then walk back from it. And so we always want to encourage people to say, go and talk to them and let them know. And Glenn's exactly right. We say this a lot to the landlords to say, what's your alternative? Great, you're going to kick somebody out. Who do you think is coming in this moment? Because we also spend a lot of time with our business owners saying, this is not a moment to open for most of you. We've had some that have opened in the last few months, and I'm very scared for them of what it's going to mean. But this is a time to really kind of hunker down. And in terms of what government can do, certainly we've been trying to push hard at the city and state on real estate taxes to say, hey, you guys need to forego, not just postpone it, but you got to get rid of the real estate taxes in this moment and have that be benefit back to the landlord and the tenant. looking at meals tax in the world of food, like other things that you can do that can keep money flowing to the business owners that then allow some of that money to go back to the landlords. But there is no question, John, in my head that in the next 6 months, we are going to see a tsunami of closures and buildings boarded up and storefronts boarded up in neighborhoods across the city. And the devastation from that, the domino effect of that is going to be generational if we can't get in front of it. And that this isn't hyperbole. This is like understanding, coming from a real estate background, like what the world is going to look like. And so you look like communities like Mattapan and East Boston, and you think, man, like this is where government needs to step in, because the longer term effect on those businesses and on those neighborhoods and on the jobs and on the community is going to be disastrous.
We are supporting the housing stability bill. And so I think definitely, so echoing, there's a role for a city, there's a role for the state. And luckily, they have some instructions that they can follow. So they have some prescriptions that they can follow. So we are supporting the housing stability bill. This is following the lead of one of our grassroots partners, City Life Vida Urbana. And as I understand it, there are actually provisions for small landlords and for small businesses in that bill. For the small business owners, so on our end, we should definitely be supporting that bill. Those of us who are providers, as I understand it, it's getting widespread support. So hopefully the state is appropriately responsive. I just got an email where, for example, United Way is supporting that bill, and so we're seeing organizations in different sectors that are supporting that bill. And then for business owners, and again, we're all in different situations. So this is definitely, I would say, for those who can manage it. I think it's a good idea right now to operate in a wider context as much as you can, meaning you might have to get politically active. So just as I'm saying on our end, we should be supporting this bill. Small business owners, if you have the energy and if you have the time and if you have the resources, I think you should be looking at how you support that bill as well. And there's just the usual, just kind of minimum support of all. And one of the ways that could look is kind of baseline, make a call to your representatives. First, find out about it, get informed about it, because as I said, as I understand, there is a provision in there for small businesses and for small landlords. And if it feels like it would benefit you and your peers and your community, at base, call your reps and get that through. And that was designed with the end of the eviction moratorium in sight. And again, with this understanding, we can't be moving in simply a response to emergency framework, but in how do we actually create permanent infrastructure? And I'm saying permanent for lack of a better word, but how do we actually create infrastructure that allows us to respond to something like this in a much better fashion next time around? So not just emergency response, but really building resilient structures.
So can I just say on this, like right now at the state, the economic development bond bill is sitting in the House and the Senate. There's a lot of money in there that is intended to be to support small businesses, direct grants, technical assistance, other support, and it's still stuck in committee. And so like advocacy to get that bill done will actually start to move some money back into our small businesses.
Sheldon, you were going to say something?
Yeah, let me put in my 2 cents. I think, going back to the landlord situation, I think that because again, been through it, and most of us who are still in the city in a commercial space, our spaces are now, of value or in demand. And so I think the most important thing still, even under this condition, I think, is to communicate as soon as possible with your landlord and start any conversations. And I think just the more communication there, the better to start to get that out in the open. And then I think the other thing around, you guys mentioned it briefly, city resources and, Office of Business Economic Development and the politicians need to know who you are as a small business, have them to your place. You're employing people, you are important. They need to know your struggles, and maybe, is that kind of consistent, banging on the head that will, maybe reach other places, and then they can, come into the process and the bill and the grant side, because I think there does need to be some, the PPP money, but there needs to be some money focused on, rent and leases, so some of that should be put in that direction. And then the other thing for folks who still have funds out there that can support these restaurants by buying, every time you're making that decision where your money is spent, is it spent for that business around the corner that you like so much? Because they appreciate it about 10 times more than they did before when you call for that takeout order. So think about where you're spending that money and that dollar, because right now it's even more critical. And don't forget to tip, because those folks, nobody's making the money like they used to make in any of these places. So every time you're spending that dollar, that local spend is much more important than it was, in the past. Forget about all these big box companies. Support the local grocer and the local, restaurant, et cetera, because they need it so badly right now. And I also live in the city here, so I'm watching places close up left and right and seeing just the struggle that everybody's going through. So think about that as well, for those who can.
We got a great question just in about pivoting to digital. What resources are there that are low cost or no cost? We talked about that you're kind of tapping into business networks and asking for advice that way. Are there any other places that people can turn for digital help?
Well, I think Nia mentioned LISC is, I think, diving deeper into this. I know they've done some programming. I mean, I've been pushing behind the scenes of how do we develop a product that actually is maybe more universally used by our companies. That gets expensive. I think maybe part of our advocacy needs to be on the digital providers, the bigger folks, and say, hey, what are we doing? How can we work together? I do think for me, there's really, again, there's two tiers. There's some of this stuff is customized towards your business, your sector, but also your individual business. So it's hard, so you really have to think about what you need for your business. But there's also universal products. I mean, what QuickBooks did for small business, I'll never forget when it came out. All of a sudden, we all knew how to do our accounting. And so I do think that there may be a universal product out there that we can develop. And we're the innovative economy, right? Massachusetts. So why are we not leaning in on this? And so I think that's on all of us to really to answer those questions as quick as possible.
Someone in our network told us about Facebook Marketplace. I haven't tried it out myself, so I can't heavily vouch for it. But it was something that was mentioned, and this was in response to the pandemic, that apparently there's some things that Facebook Marketplace is doing to make it easier for businesses to have a digital presence. And just to Glenn's point about kind of like a universal platform, that may be something. And this, I'd say this this remark that I'm about to say is completely off the cuff. This is just a brainstorm, an idea that I'm throwing out there just to contextualize it properly. But it just occurs to me that it could be something that a group of businesses or that peers of businesses could come together to think about, how they kind of share a platform just to reduce whatever types of costs they would be looking at. It would have to make sense. But this does seem like maybe this is something that, again, a few businesses could maybe collaborate on and not try to go it on their own.
So I can give an example of that. So when we look at a lot of the restaurants we work with and the digital issues they have, that literally for many of them, the only digital platform they have is Facebook and Twitter. Very often their menus aren't online. And they don't have touchless, they don't have contactless purchasing. So we've been in some conversations with some of the point of sale companies, and there's lots of them, to say, you guys are avoiding, you're missing an entire sector of these small businesses, immigrant women, Latino, right, Black-owned businesses in neighborhoods, that there's enormous market share potential for you. And we can help you make that connection, but here's what we need from you. And so the negotiation is, you got to change your fee structure, and at least in the first year, and you have to put the support in to actually help these businesses get connected online. Because one of the things we keep seeing, and especially in these smaller businesses, and this is in food, but others as well, is they don't have a lot of excess capacity, right? Like it's a single person that owns their business and they are doing everything. Or it's, 3 or 4 people, they don't have anybody in their team who's able to take this on. And so what we keep finding, and Glenn can talk to this better than I, like how much, like in this moment, as much as we want to empower businesses to teach them to do the work, this is a moment where we need to do some of that work for them, because there's just so much that they're having to deal with. And so I think trying to find places where there are systematic solutions that can be working across multiple businesses is how we are going to find ways to scale solutions that are going to have the kind of impact we need, given how many businesses are affected by what's going on right now.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in on that also, Jen, which is, I want to use Amazon as an example, because if Amazon's Q2 of this year was 89 billion and 5 billion in profit, right? They were expecting to lose money in Q2 for COVID. And I bring this up because, one, and I'm going to admit it on the screen right now, is my wife and I use Amazon. So it's like, it's hard not to use it, right? And every time I see that package, I'm like, oh. But the reality is, that's the behavior of the consumer right now, right? It has been heading in that direction, and then it's doubled down. The reason there is such an interesting case study is because Amazon lost money for years. What have they done? They invested to build their infrastructure, so they have not only a digital platform, but an entire infrastructure ready to take advantage of people being in their homes and so on and so forth. So it's almost like they were built for this moment. And so for us to think how our small companies are going to compete with that, you just got to, and by the way, Wall Street supported that investment. They were okay that they weren't making earnings. And so what are you talking about? So we need to think that same way. We need to invest in our company the same way. You're not going to get that return like that. You need to build the infrastructure up so you can compete respectively. So anyway, I do think we got to look at this kind of holistically. And I would suggest, to Sheldon's point, in a lot of ways, our local folks, we have better products. We know our community. We should be supporting these folks, and we need to how to figure out how to cut through to be able to do that. And so I'll end it on that moment.
Yeah, if I could just, kind of piggyback on that in a couple of areas quickly, but, obviously in this time, all these small companies that are, mom and pops, et cetera, service is critical, and through the digital, ordering and marketing, all that critical, because somebody will bip and go somewhere else. So, all that is critical. But I don't want to go backwards too much, John, but when you talk about what can be done, and this is actually a question I have too for the community development corporations. So were established to help develop areas that weren't developing in the city. And I'm trying to understand where that is going. And that's from the point of commercial, right? So they develop, a lot of commercial real estate, a lot of main streets, right? Where they actually get monies at a discount, and sometimes land. So my understanding is that is to go and keep community and that's there, and help to develop businesses that are there, stay there, and grow. And so somewhere there is a disconnect, because from a commercial side, there isn't the discount. I mean, there's a lot of market rate in these projects. And it doesn't allow for that small mom and pop or business of color to come in and then grow and be successful. And even the projects that are going on right now. Now, part of it is, some of the expense to build, but something is missing there. And so I think there's an opportunity there. And again, maybe that's through the channels of the politicians in the city, but there needs to be more focus on the city. The CDC is bringing along some of these businesses. to get them to a better place. Because again, it comes back to all the community, and like, we shouldn't have communities that are totally gentrifying. It should be a mix of those who have been there for 30 years with the new hipsters coming in, with the tech people coming in, because that's everybody together, and that'll cure a lot of ills that we have in the society. So like, how do we do it? And so that's, I don't have all the solutions, but I think there is a way, and it is through land and lease.
Great, thanks, Sheldon. I hate to cut this conversation off because it's great, and we could keep going for another hour, but we're running out of time here. That's some great advice from everyone. I really appreciate you taking the time to provide it. I'm going to pass the baton over to Perry Newman, who is CEO of the Dorchester Bay Economic Development Corp., to provide some closing words. And just want to thank all the panelists for sharing their insight and wisdom. I know it's a stressful time for all of us, but I think that the people on the call really benefited from this. So Perry, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, John. And I only wish we could have, a second hour of this conversation, because the Dorchester Bay EDC is a community development corporation, a CDC, and we're trying to strike the right balance that Sheldon referred to just a moment ago between preserving our community and also having to make our own ends meet when, as we develop properties, it's very expensive and we don't get a ton of discounts from our lenders, although, there's a cost structure that's very arcane, which would make a very interesting second half of this discussion. I want to thank our panelists who've added so much, to this conversation. Those of us here on the screen, so to speak, kind of live and breathe these issues every day, and we're in contact with each other very, very, very frequently. And still, there are things that I get out of this that I hope we'll be able to put into practice for the betterment of the community. I want to thank the Globe, of course, for its role in putting this together, and thank J.P. Morgan Chase for their philanthropy and they're bringing us together as well. Just a couple closing thoughts. We've heard an awful lot about pivoting. We heard an awful lot about stabilizing businesses and the resources that are necessary to do this. I think the real, call to action here is we need some kind of, as Jen put it, sort of a Main Street bailout. There just needs to be so much injected into the system to provide some kind of stability for businesses. We're not in a situation where we can just sort of limp along and think that things are going to come out of it as we would in sort of your garden variety business slowdown. This is structural. And I saw that there was one question in the Q&A box indicating, is this an opportunity for a big structural reform in a different way of capitalism and so on and so forth, which would necessitate a third hour of conversation today. But I will say this, one of the things that makes our work possible, and I think the work of everybody on this panel, is philanthropy. Throughout this crisis, I've seen some funders pivot to funding much more exigent needs and responding to the situation on the ground and providing more unrestricted funds. I saw some questions about are there resources available to help companies bridge the digital divide and provide more resources to enable companies to get online and develop a platform and so on and so forth. Philanthropic support to organizations that are intermediaries, so to speak, such as ours, can enable us to pass some of those resources available so that companies can stabilize and make that pivot. So it really is going to take an awful lot of things, the doggedness of entrepreneurs, the willingness to pivot, the willingness to say it's not working anymore, I got to do something different, the willingness to deploy networks to find out who can be of service to you in your daily life and so forth. And I'm encouraged both by the conversation, but by the creativity of everybody on the panel that has done a tremendous job of kind of, trying to staunch the bleeding during this very, very difficult time. So we're happy to be a part of the conversation. As a small business lender, we're trying to help our companies, our borrowers, and our small business technical assistance clients navigate through this. And it's going to be a long road. I think it's going to go on for a while, but I think there's reason for cautious optimism, largely because of the unwillingness of many people to simply concede defeat. And the absolute necessity to be resilient and carry on. So I want to thank everybody for their participation. It's been a pleasure as an attendee and panelist.